And by the way, a programming note, the Dark Side of the Ring Season 4 episodes continue on this week, this Tuesday, June the 13th, the Graham family. Eddie and Mike Graham, specifically, it's centered on, and not only the dynasty that Eddie Graham built in Florida, but also the unfortunate trend of suicide in his family. And as well, there's some talk of Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie's roots and the name of the Graham family in general. That's Vice TV at 10 o'clock Eastern time on Tuesday, June 13th is the debut of that episode. Have you seen, did we even talk about this? I forget. I talk to you so much. Have you seen the Candido and Magnum episodes yet?
I did. We talked about the Magnum one, and I just saw the Candido one because I missed it the first time around. It took me a while to finally see it.
What did you think? You may even have been at some of the shows that there was footage of him in his younger days.
I knew Chris. I first met him at the Arezzi convention in '93.
Well, I know. That's why I was saying I think you would probably were you actually on screen in any of that, or were you carefully hidden?
I was carefully hidden, I guess.
But back to your story.
No, I wasn't in any of the clips on there, but I was around during a lot of that period of time. I lost touch with Chris right around the time he got really heavily into ECW.
You said that you phrased it in such you could have substituted ECW for like heroin or whatever, and it was.
Well, no, you know what it was? I mean, because again, I recognize Darkside because it only tells so much of the story in the time constraints they had. They didn't interview Tammy. There was a lot of Tammy, but they tried to keep the focus on Chris. But they're so intertwined, and there was a lot of Tammy, and there was a lot of stuff left out. But Chris, part of the big Chris story that people don't talk about so much anymore, but Chris was like Dennis Carluzzo's number one guy. Like Dennis treated Chris like a son. Put his world championship on him. He was all for Chris working for you. He wanted you to hire. He wanted Chris to get a break.
Yeah.
They were very close. The NWA tournament, November 94, Cherry Hill, Smoky Mountain guys are there, obviously. Chris wins the NWA title. That was because of Dennis. And when Chris went to ECW, it's not as simple as just he went to ECW and that was it. But Chris himself was going through shit and changing. And him and Dennis, their relationship just dissolved. I don't even think there was a big fight or anything. It was just Chris was part of a new group of people. And he no longer kept up with Dennis. And that's right around a period of time, coincidentally enough, where I kind of stopped keeping up with Chris.
Well, and also Chris was so focused on this is where I'm going to be now. I got to make it, the best thing I can be or the best thing it can be. And that's when we talked about it or referred to it in the show. But Paul had convinced Chris that he was his assistant something or other. I don't know if he gave him an official title, but here, Chris, you handle this for me. And that's why he had charged all those plane tickets, all that travel to his personal credit card, because then Paul would reimburse him in cash. I don't know what the ECW accounting methods were, but an independent contractor working for me uses his personal credit card to buy plane tickets for all the boys. And at some point later on, after he's run up a big tab, I hand him a big wad of cash. That sounds perfectly legitimate. But nevertheless,
that story you always talk about, the famous night where you make your lone appearance in ECW and you're in the limo with Dennis and it's Chris and Paul, you and Chris put together that deal. So much of the focus is about Paul and Dennis. But really, that's right around the period of time where Dennis and Chris stopped talking. So there's that whole dynamic too, because they were as close as you could be and now they weren't.
And that was the thing, is that Chris thought, okay, I'm going to be in the office and I get to wrestle and I can do this for Paul. And maybe I've seen guys, be all excited about being part of something to the point where they were blind to the fact that they were putting themselves out on a limb. And eventually Paul didn't come through with the wad of cash. Chris had the big credit card bill, and he and Tammy had bought a house. And he told me this himself, a year or two later. And they lost the house because they couldn't pay because their fucking credit got shot and they owed all the money and a blah, blah, blah. So that at that point he was just, thinking I'm going to do whatever I can do for ECW, and because this is, my chance to be, Paul will use me, which of course he did. I'm not saying he didn't, but he used him on the cards, and he used him on off the cards also. But anyway, that was the episode.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot more to it. Even the whole Chris and Tammy dynamic. As someone who was around it for a little bit, briefly, and again, I talked to Chris, but Tammy was around, and she was always cool with me, to be very honest. I know everyone has a Tammy horror story, maybe because I was kind of close in age to her. She wasn't that much older than me. She was cool with me. But, everyone focuses on the Shawn stuff. There were other things before then, too, and after then, and, not to go too deep into this, everyone's always like, why did Chris put up with it? I've always wondered if maybe Chris didn't mind, and I hate to put it that way, but I know other wrestlers that had incidents where they say, Tammy threw herself at them when Chris was in the shower. I've heard that story from more than one person. And, if it happens more than once, it makes you almost feel like, I don't know. I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but everyone focuses on, okay, Shawn was the thing, and then that kind of changed the dynamic in the relationship. I mean, there were other things before then. There were other things.
At some points, I've almost thought she was trying to run him off. And not,
interesting. Huh.
At some point, because it wasn't just, she could also be snippy. And there were points in time where they were together because they'd always been together, but they weren't necessarily romantic, is the way that it was phrased to me. But he was obviously more devoted to her than she was to him.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think she knew that for a while there, she couldn't have even gotten involved in this and gotten into it at any level without him. If that makes any sense also. Not only after she got in, but also he was a big, how could you not be around Chris if you were, or not learn about the wrestling business being around Chris?
He was obsessed with it.
So that's why she was, in addition to her natural heelishness, she got good from scratch because she'd been around him. If half the people on television today, if they could ride in a car with Chris Candido, they'd probably learn more about the wrestling business than they know. Anyway, but so once again, catch them while they're hot and get them while they're still on the air. Vice TV. We don't know what's going on with Vice, but our friends at Darkside, they've got the programs. They're going to ride that horse to the bitter end.
Are they creditors?
I don't know. I think that they're on a barter system. They've not really any money changing hands. And I believe they've been paid so far. Well, they're on the air. So anyway,
those aren't the same thing, but okay.
Speaking of, let's see, look here, we're on the air. And I'll tell you who I'm paying